Why is Africa so poor? How could a place that holds trillions of dollars in rare minerals, gems, and other resources be so incredibly impoverished? And for many, the answer is simple enough. Africa is poor because of the legacy of colonialism. The narrative usually goes something like this. Europe's great powers invaded, conquered, and pillaged Africa of its raw resources, leaving the continent impoverished to this very day. Now, more than 60 years after the end of colonial rule, the continent is still struggling to overcome decades of exploitation at the hands of the European powers. It's a compelling narrative, and many people believe it. But the problem is, it doesn't seem to be telling the whole story, and here's the proof. Consider the story of another ex-colony that gained its independence around the same time as most African nations. Singapore, a former British colony with virtually no natural resources, has risen to become one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Today, Singapore is actually richer on a per capita basis than its former colonizer. So if colonialism doesn't tell the entire story there, is there anything else that can explain why Africa specifically is so poor? Well, one interesting factor is Africa's geography. The economist Thomas Sowell points out that bad geography has hindered the continent's development for centuries and continues to do so to this very day. For example, while Europe's long coastline and plentiful natural harbors helped to facilitate a strong maritime trade all the way back to classical antiquity, Africa has had few of these features. In fact, the continent actually has less coastline than Europe, despite the fact that it's much bigger. It has very few deep water ports, and with the exception of the Nile, none of Africa's major rivers are easily navigable all the way to the ocean. These geographical problems create huge challenges to trade in Africa, but geography is not destiny. Just look at Botswana. This sub-Saharan country has set records for economic growth despite being landlocked in the middle of the Kalahari Desert. While Botswana does have plenty of diamonds, it lacks many of the other major natural resources, rivers, or harbors that many of its neighbors do. And yet, Botswana is one of the richest nations in Africa with a strong and growing economy. The story of both Botswana and Singapore show that the true culprits behind Africa's persistent poverty has to be something else. Now consider this. In the Tanzanian Constitution in 1965, it discussed the government's role to, quote, prevent the accumulation of wealth to an extent which is inconsistent with the existence of a classless society. This Marxist sentiment was not unusual in sub-Saharan African governments post-colonialism. The bottom line is, many former colonies have not only overcome prior subjugation, but have thrived both politically and economically. But they all seem to have something in common. Instead of trading colonialism for Marx, they adopted systems which encouraged private property rights while at the same time embracing stable governments which established dependable legal systems and then courted foreign investment. The good news is there is hope for countries still struggling to develop, but history suggests that it will come not only through political freedom, but economic freedom as well.
The land of the blacks was a vast land, a big world unto itself, covering 12 million square miles, from its northernmost point to what is now Tunisia to Cape Aqualis is approximately 5,000 miles, and in its widest extent from east to west is 4,600 miles, because we're talking about a continent. The whole of this second largest continent was once Balad as Sudan, the land of the blacks, and not just the southern region to which they had steadily pushed from the north. After Asian, Greek, and Roman occupations, the term Sudan came to indicate the areas not yet taken from the blacks and was coextensive with the Ethiopian Empire. From the Ethiopian Empire, once extended from the Mediterranean north to southward to the source of the Nile and the country Abyssinia, which recently reverted to the ancient name of the Ethiopian Empire, of which the earlier times it formed its southern province. Even as late as the times of Menes in 3100 BC, Ethiopia still included 3/4 of Egypt for up to 29 degrees north parallel. The Asians held the Delta region, hence the two lands, well known to all historians, but never fully explained. To explain the two lands, of course, would blast a myth about the builders of the Egyptian civilization. It was pointed out that the study of the blacks must begin in Egypt because more of the indestructible monuments are there, And further, because many of the artifacts archaeologists have been uncovering during the past 25 years as Egyptian are in fact African. Yet the very heartland of the race and the cradle of civilization were actually further southward below the first cataract, centered around the capital cities of Napata and Meroe. For from three black civilizations spread northward, reaching its spectacular achievements in what became known as Egyptian civilization. The general condition of the vast stretches of land over the continent, uninhibited and uninhabitable, seemed to support the Western thesis that Africans never developed any worthwhile civilization, had no notable historic past, and the more charitable might add that in the very nature of their situation, it could not be otherwise. Samuel Baker went far in promoting the idea of African innate inferiority, even if he had to use the most forbidding area in Africa to do it, the terrible swamplands of the Sud, an area south of Khartoum that in its full extent is as big as England. No one would claim that any kind of society, civilized or savage, could exist in the Sud swamplands, probably the largest in the world, for it was neither all land or water, but a seemingly endless mass of rotting vegetation, interwoven tree-like vines, steaming heat, swarming man-killing mosquitoes, crocodiles, hippos, and other unknown forms of tropical life. The conclusion of Baker and others was that they were in a land where time had stood still since the beginning, where life never advanced, and the human species was simply rotated in aimless cycles like the animal life in the Sud. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday. Welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. Now, we've just completed our reading of Dr. Amos Wilson's The Falsification of African Consciousness, which is a great book. I thank you all for choosing that book. It was a great book. It was a great read. It was a great time. And we've completed it now. And now we're on to our new book, Chancellor Williams's historic book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD. And I'm starting off with Chancellor Williams basically giving an overview of Africa. And we're going to get into, I guess we can say the foundation of the destruction of Africa, the foundation of how Africa became what it is today. And so that's why I paired it with the video of the white guy talking about how Africa had the history of colonization, and he compared the continent of Africa to the country of Singapore. Did you see that? And then he later threw in Botswana. But the continent of Africa is being compared to the country of Singapore. And the white man's objective is to basically state that colonization isn't the sole or even the main reason why Africa as a continent is in the state that it's in. Because you have to look at Singapore. Singapore had a similar history. And because of the similar history of Singapore, if Singapore can come out of its colonized past and become what it is today, then the African continent can come out of its colonized past and be what Singapore is, or even greater, because it's a continent that's being compared to a country. Now, the best thing about that and what we're reading in Destruction of Black Civilization, and link is in the bio, so make sure you like this video, comment, share, subscribe if you have not subscribed, tell a friend to tell a friend to tell a friend. All y'all watch, like, comment, and subscribe, right? So what we're getting into today is the why Africa is what it is today. But we're going to add more context to it, because that man in that video, he was half-assing it, right? Because he talked about only European colonization. He only talked about European colonization. So what we're going to do is add more context and add more history and talk about the history of colonization on the African continent. Wave after wave after wave after wave after wave of colonizers coming in to take all of the natural resources, including the humans, to strip Africa of everything that it has, to make Africa the hub of the world, to take what you want. And if you are continuously taken from, and even the Chinese is there now. Remember, the Chinese is in Africa now. So if this one place for thousands and thousands of years have been constantly stripped of its natural resources, what state is it supposed to be in? If this continent for hundreds of years have had foreign occupations that have destroyed the country, destroyed the governments, and ran them the way that they wanted to run them, meaning the Europeans, running them in the favors of the Europeans, so the European countries can continue to enrich themselves, then what do you expect? But we're going to get into it. So, because I'm already on one this morning, and he struck a nerve with that, because he has the nerve to compare the country of Singapore to the continent of Africa. He's just playing in our face like we just don't know. All right, so I started my reading on chapter 1, page 46, and I'm picking up on page 47, paragraph. This is the second paragraph on page 47, as late as the 1840s. And there's a link in the description for you to get your copy of this book. If you don't have a copy of Destruction of Black Civilization, get it ASAP. There's a link in the description for you to get your copy. So let's jump back into it, because we got some history to cover, since the white guy is acting like nothing happened to Africa, but European colonization in the continent should behave the same way as a country. Okay, so as late as the 1840s and 50s, these explorers, even the most ignorant, should have known that in the same vast continent of wastelands, tropical rainforests, and swamplands, there were also areas of arable land in civilized states. But they wrote about what they saw the most: vast stretches of wasteland and secluded groups of strange people. But as we shall see, some of the great kingdoms and empire builders in Africa seem not to have known the meaning of failure or had any ideas about surrendering to fate. Ejected here, they led the people there and began to build again. Wherever the splintered off refugee groups found a place where the soil seemed favorable for civilization and the land unoccupied by preceding migrants, they settled and began to build villages again. A sense of relative security was a necessary factor in deciding to begin a new settlement. A crucial question was, how many miles had they put between the slave hunters and themselves? For the kind of houses and community buildings they would erect depended directly on the probability of permanent settlement or sudden flight again. In short, whether to build large, sturdy, and attractive compound homes and temples of worship or easily demolished huts. It was for reasons of security that so many of these groups, later called tribes or societies, sought the most hidden and isolated areas they could find. This permanent separation from their kinsmen and other groups was generally quite contrary to their hearts' desires. The original splintering off and parting was often in tears. But breaking up into smaller units seemed to be the only route to survival in a permanent crisis situation, apparently permanent since the movement of people over the continent had been going on so far beyond the memory of each generation that migrations and temporary settlements were among the most significant facts in the oral tradition of each society. So remember, first point, it's the splintering off of groups, the splintering off and rejoining of groups. So now we're talking about before civilizations, before societies, and how civilizations and societies were created. It was the splintering off and or the joining of different groups of people on the continent of Africa. So the first point is how we separated from ourselves. That's the first point. So fragmentation and isolation had two momentous consequences. The first was that the isolation of various people led to the development of over 2,000 different dialects and languages, right? The second fateful outcome was that the rise of all these tongues widened the gulf between the blacks and the territorial distances had already achieved. One should pause here for reflection if there is any serious attempt to really understand what happened to the African people and why, right? For even without the aid of Western writers in emphasizing the language differences and the cultural variations and attempting to show how unrelated the blacks are, they themselves came into the time to consider themselves unique, and each society not only independent of the other, but its enemy, if only potentially. This unity and mutual suspicion became the African way of life. Small chiefdoms sprang up everywhere, often no more than a single village of 100 or 200 people. Africa therefore presented itself to Asia and Europe as the ideal land for exploitation, enslavement, and conquest. Tribalism is one of our first and oldest problems. Tribalism, the splintering off of different groups. So groups separated, and they separated so far and so long that different ideologies were created, different languages were created, different cultural practices were created. They became different groups of people, still African, but culturally, mentally, and idealistically, they're different people. So now we're fragmented. And remember, the Asians are the oldest foes. So we have the Asians, we have the Arabs, we have the Greeks, we have the Romans, we have the Europeans, right? And our fragmentation, our own splintering of ourselves, the Asians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, and then the Europeans, and now the Chinese. So that's 7 groups of people coming into the continent. 7 groups of colonizers, 7 groups of people taking resources, all natural resources, including human beings, away from the continent of Africa. There were then different outcomes for different societies. Some perished even to the last member from disease, starvation, or warfare. Others despairing of ever again being able to have a fixed abode, become nomads. Some, although isolated so long that they have developed different languages and customs, had nevertheless decided that salvation required a union with other groups. So now we know we fragmented, we know we splintered off, but if we want to survive, we got to come together. If we want to survive, and if we want to become stronger and be able to protect ourselves better, we have to come together. That's a good idea, right? These were the tribes that merged with other tribes, lost their separate identity and languages, who evolved from this process a single common language larger than their large chiefdoms, kingdoms, and finally empires that begin the rebirth of their long lost civilization. The fiercest wars between the blacks occurred in the founding and expansion of new kingdoms and empires. For while the core groups were voluntary confederations, expansions of empire required the conquest of neighboring states, usually small independent chiefdoms that preferred to maintain their absolute sovereignty. The repercussions from this forced unity by conquest were to shake the continent from end to end centuries later when Europeans' political rule ended. So I've been saying this for a while. I've said this in these book readings. I've said this in our Friday breakdowns, right? I've always told people that, remember, when we think about what happened to Africa, but when we think about the behavior of human beings are conquerors. Human beings like power. Human beings like to be in control. And African people were conquering African people. I just read it in Destruction of Black Civilization. In order for empires, kingdoms, chiefdoms, all those things to be built, especially empires, other groups of African people had to be conquered by African people. Now, the manner in which they were conquered were different. But nevertheless, the conquering happened. But us conquering ourselves left us vulnerable. As he said, the Europeans, they pounced on that. They pounced on that. Remember, I've always given the example of when the Europeans came in, they seen two different groups of black people warring against each other. So the Europeans would partner with the weaker group, take out the stronger groups, and then turn on the weaker group. And now the Europeans have the land and the power. Modern Africans and students of Africa have tended to emphasize the destructive impact of European imperialism in Africa, while ignoring the most damaging developments from the Arab impact before the general European takeover in the last quarter of the 19th century, a relatively recent period. This point is important, for one of the most remarkable chapters in the history of the blacks is that dealing with these dauntless leaders and people who have lost one state after another, along with the 3/4 of the kinsmen, nevertheless overrode all the forces of destruction and death and began to build, always once again, still another state. From the earliest times, the elimination of these states as independent African sovereignties had been an Asian objective, stepped up by Muslim onslaughts after the 7th century AD. So the re-established black states were still being conquered and Islamicized when Europeans began to arrive in greater numbers to impose their rule over both Asians and Africans. The big thing that happened here, to repeat, is generally glossed over, ignored, or forgotten. The last being a pretension, since a historical development of this magnitude could hardly be forgotten by serious writers on Africa. For what happened, very simply, was that European imperialism in Africa checked and replaced Arab imperialism. The Arab screams against Western imperialism are the screams of outrage against Western Caucasians for checking and subduing Eastern Caucasians in the very midst of the blacks they had conquered. There are still countless thousands of blacks who are naive enough to believe that the Arabs' bitter attack on Western colonialism show their common cause with Black Africa. And that's a great point to bring up. The Arabs came into Africa as conquerors. So one thing we do know is the Arab slave trade has been pillaging from the eastern coast of Africa for maybe over 1,500 years now. But we know between 13 and 1,500 years that the Arab slave trade continuously, it may have some small interruptions, but pretty much continuously over the past at least 1,300 years. So the Arab occupation and Arab imperialism that's been happening in Africa has been very damaging, but not a lot of people have been talking about it and focusing on it because they've always focused on the European imperialism and not the Arab imperialism. Remember, the Arabs were just the group that came before the Europeans. Once again, we're talking about the splintering and the conquest of African people by other African people. Talking about Asian conquest, Greek conquest, Roman conquest, Arab conquest, European conquest, and then the Chinese are back in there, right? So yeah, there's a succession of conquerors that came in and took over Africa and took from Africa, right? And so for the Arabs to act as if they are our friends is a slap in the face. What did Dr. John Henrik Clarke tell us? If you want a friend, damn it, look in the mirror, because you have no friends. That's why so many people are crying after this last election. Oh, I can't believe the white people voted for Trump. Why? What have we been telling you from the beginning? We have no friends. We're in this by ourselves. Don't let any other group pretend. All other groups have either exploited us or turned their backs on us, including ourselves. There's no group of people on the face of this earth, including Black people, who have not exploited or turned their backs on Black people. And whatever group of black people you want to think about, throw them all in that group, but especially black Americans, especially African people. We have no friends. It's up to us to save us. Now, think about also what I'm reading. I'm reading a book that's telling us about how African people have known conquest. And despite the conquest that they've known, they've rebuilt and they've came back stronger and stronger. African people continue to rebuild, but we're stronger together and we have to continue to rebuild. The facts we have then show that after they lost Egypt and the Eastern Sudan, some Africans, overriding all adverse conditions, grouped themselves to form the nations and developed a high order of civilization independent of any external influences. Others never settled anywhere long enough to develop anything notable, but seemed to remain in a state of lethargy or suspended animation. They had surrendered to fate and became too weak to fight back. They descended to a state of semi-barbarism, descended because most of these societies had known better times and a higher order of life. Some, in more favorable circumstances, nevertheless, failed to advance. Still others were in the class discussed in connection with cannibalism, hunger-crazed people who had sunk to the lowest levels of dog-eat-dog existence. These last are the people about whom the European and American authors delight to write. No cartoons are better known than those showing a sweating white man, usually an explorer or missionary, being cooked in a huge black pot while black savages dance around with human bones decorating their heads and stuck through their pierced nose. The idea these experts on Africa have been painting in the minds of the people of the world are still actively planting is that this is Africa. These are the savages who are now clamoring for independence. That's a big deal. That's important because now remember, we're talking about how narratives and ideas are shaped and how the ideas of different groups of people are shaped. Propaganda, stereotypes. Remember, I told you about the stereotype machine. A stereotype originally is actually a machine used to print negative propaganda against Native Americans. The stereotypes, the propaganda, the stories, the narratives. Savages don't need independence because savages can't handle independence. N-words can't handle independence. The more N-words we make, the better excuse or the better explanation we have of why these N-words need to be enslaved or ruled over, because they don't have the capacity to rule over themselves. Now, another thing the white guy in the video did mention is the role that nature played, or the land in Africa, how it played in hindering some of the development. And so we're going to go further into that because he has a point in that. So the video he's made it has some truth filled with a whole bunch of nonsense, right? But there is a point in the role that nature played in how Africa is shaped into becoming what it is today. So let's jump into it, right? Nature joins the attack. The questions of physiography, vegetation, climate, water, and soil are all more crucial in the history of the blacks than they are in the case of any other people. For here, a whole continent is involved. Once again, a whole continent is involved. And on that continent, a people who in one period of time were among the foremost people on earth, and in a larger period, the farthest behind. Nature itself set an environmental stage in a manner and under conditions which appear to have been diagnosed to test the utmost one race's moral, intellectual, and physical powers to override all obstacles to survival. So that's just getting into it, letting us know what we're about to read about nature, because nature basically, Africa has habitable parts and inhabitable parts. And in some cases, some people were relegated to inhabitable parts. While, like I read earlier, The people who were in the habitable parts were ignored because we know the history of large, extensive empires being erected in Africa and happening, and kingdom after kingdom after kingdom, empire after empire after empire. So yes, Africa has some lands that aren't the best for living, but Africa has lands that are great for living. So now we're talking about shaping narrative. So the people who were on the land that were not the best were more vulnerable. So the land did play a challenge in decreasing the security of the people who occupied those lands. So even in this, the physical geography of Africa was favorable to the peaceful settlers who later were to become its conquerors and rulers. For the seacoast is lowland everywhere, not more than 500 feet above sea level, and remains lowland 500 miles inland. Asian and European occupation of the seacoast of North Africa and East Africa was therefore relatively easy and probably even welcomed at first by the blacks as co-partners in world trade. But the poor and the hungry nomads from the vast deserts areas of the Middle East poured into the most fertile and easily accessible areas of this other land of deserts that is North Africa. There were several consequences of the greatest historical importance, which are generally not sufficiently stressed. The first was that both the Saharan transformation and the steady incursion of Asians pressured more and more blacks back into the interior to concentrate into the already limited survival areas where just to subsist was a daily struggle. The second important result was the widespread amalgamation of the races. For the weaker, more submissive blacks remained in Asian occupied territory to become slave laborers and slave soldiers, to the witness and ruthless sexual traffic in black women that gave rise to the new breed of Afro-Asians. These were classed as Caucasians or Asians. They themselves bitterly objected to being identified with the race of their mothers, African. When these later became known as Egyptians in Egypt, Moors in Morocco, and Mauritanians or Carthaginians in Carthage, great care was taken to distinguish them from Africans in daily intercourse, in paintings, and in documentary literature. This new breed of half African was to join with their Asian fathers and forefathers in the wars and enslaving raids against the blacks that went on century after century until North Africa was eventually taken. Now, that's an interesting point, because when I put out my Hannibal Barca video, right, especially when we're talking about the Carthaginians, white folk trying to jump down my back telling me that Hannibal is not black and all these things there. But we're talking about mixed race people who will conquer. When you conquer people, you mix with them. So there were a mixture of races in Carthage. There was a mixture of races in Mauritania and Morocco, just like there are now. Just like there are now. But I guarantee you, all those people have African in them. All those people have African in them. Still, another fateful geographical factor that favored the invaders has been implied or partly stated in the foregoing observations. Aside from the easy occupation of the lowlands of the seacoast and the gradual taking over of the rich lands of the Nile Valley and its ancient civilizations, both Asians and Europeans found the highlands of southern and eastern Africa more pleasant and healthy for Caucasian settlement. This meant that even after nature had damned 3/4 of the continent's landmass as impossible to support human life, the Asians and Europeans came in to seize and hold the best of the 1/4 that was left. The blacks found themselves cut off from all seacoasts that then mattered, hemmed in from all directions and confined within narrower and narrower limits. Thus, they became a wandering people, forever migrating in their own vast homeland, fragmenting from great unified nations into countless little splintered societies. Once again, the empires and the nations that were built were destroyed. Now you're talking about small groups of people becoming nomads and more vulnerable for the next group of conquerors. And splendid societies becoming so isolated from each other that each formed a new language of its own, considered itself quite different from its original brothers, now regarded as strangers and enemies in the endless tribal wars that ensued over the inhabitable land. The land over which these struggles went on varied in different regions. So did the climate that so greatly affected it. The people and even some of the institutions vary under environmental influences. The landmass in the eastern regions, for example, had been undergoing a vertical movement of elevation and seeking along with a leveling process occasioned by the atmosphere and wandering since Mycenaean times. Geologists trace the elevation of the mountains in the area, even Kilimanjaro, and the faulting and fracturing that created the Great Rift, so early volcanic activity. So the land there, the best of the land were taken by the occupants, the Asians, the Arabs, the Europeans, the people who came in, the Romans, the Greeks. The best of the lands were taken. So African people were relegated to the worst of the habitable land, even living on habitable lands. So we're talking about environmental factors as well as your enemies occupying the best of your land and relegating you to being nomads, even cannibalism, right? Nomads, cannibalism, right? In a sense, not all people, but in some senses, because they were nomads and trying to survive, right? So you were vulnerable for the next conquerors. As I stated earlier, you're vulnerable to the next set of conquerors that are coming in. And now you've redeveloped new languages, redeveloped new cultural patterns, redeveloped new ways of life that are different from your brothers that you were living with, that you were flourishing with. So now smaller groups of people are wandering around with less protection and less security. So let me find my all right, so here we go. This accelerated depopulation of the black man's countries, resulting from the nature of soil and climate, mass enslavement, deaths and resisting slavery, wars of conquest, intertribal conflicts, exhaustions from the endless flights and migrations, and ever-present disease. All this reduced the black population by 3/4. Let me read that again. This accelerated depopulation of the black man's countries, resulting from the nature of the soil and climate, mass enslavement, deaths and resisting slavery, wars of conquest, intertribal conflicts, exhaustions from the endless flights and migrations, and ever-present disease. All this reduced the black population by 3/4. Under reasonable, favorable conditions, the African population today would be 4 times its present number. And when it is pointed out that 3/4 of the people today are still weakened by malaria and malnutrition, reference is made to the 1/4 of the people who survived in spite of it all. How then were the blacks able to battle invading enemies from one end of the continent to the other for several thousand years? True, they were overcome in the end, but what sustained them through all these centuries of struggle on so many different fronts and against so many different kinds of enemies? Right? Weakened so generally by both disease and what became perpetual hunger, whence came their strength and courage to carry on. It may well be that the answers lie in the death-defying pyramids they built in Egypt when the land was theirs. There must be a number of preconditions without which the genius of any people for thinking, inventing, discovering, and building would be inhibited and may even die under extreme circumstances. And so now we get into what he calls the preconditions for progress. A few of these preconditions for progress are: number one, the people must become famine free and be able to end their perennial roaming from place to place in search of food and water and settle down. So reference that to us. We must unite. We must unite and be able to sustain ourselves with the basics. Number two, having found suitable territory, the leaders must produce through negotiations with other neighboring societies and fragmented groups to build nations. Black people in America must build a nation. We must build a black nation. We must remember ourselves. We can't continue to be fragmented like we are. Think about what he's reading, what I'm reading, what I'm reading, what he wrote is still relevant to us today because these are prescriptions. These are answers to some of the questions that we have. But the chains on our brains are so tight. Will we because this book has been around for a while. And how have we actually used some of the information in the book? But nevertheless, so. Number 3, there must be developed, and this is a crucial precondition, a sense of national community among the various language groups that make up the country. This is so important that it cannot be left to wishful thinking or chance. It must be programmed in such a way that a sense of loyalty and of being an important part of a great united brotherhood, which is the nation itself, will develop naturally. Going back to what Neely Fuller was talking about and developing those codes of conduct and us operating as a united force under those codes of conduct. 4 is a strong army for defense. We can't defend ourselves if we can't unite. 5 is the reign of law and justice, applying equally to all classes in the society. The people must feel absolutely secure as individuals and that in their country there is equal justice for all. In short, certain conditions in a country can bring about that internal peace, stability, and confidence, which unshackle the mind. Read that again. In short, certain conditions in the country can bring about that internal peace, stability, and confidence, which unshackle the mind. There's now time to think. No more trekking and bleeding feet for hundreds of miles across rocky deserts. No more seeing your kinsmen fall out and welcome death along the way. At home at last. Better farms, plenty of food, and now time to think. There's nothing mystical about the reasons why one group of people can easily become physically and mentally strong, while another becomes physically weak and less mentally alert. And that goes back to what that man was talking about in the video. An abundance of nutritious food and pure drinking water may spell the difference between advance and decay. The number of death-dealing diseases developing from malnutrition alone is alarming. But what should be stressed above everything else is that the millions of babies may become both physically and mentally retarded by disease while in their mother's wombs, which is another way of saying that a people woefully ignorant or indifferent to basic health can themselves become inferior in fact. But even this central fact, when fully realized, will still remain in the field of more discussion until Blacks everywhere begin mass organization or mass education of the masses. The system is so structured worldwide that Blacks are forced into conditions that can lead to inferiority, even genetically. There must be a breakthrough or gradual extinction. This is the final precondition for survival and advancement. But he's going back to what he was saying, like, we are what we eat. And even our poor diets lead to our poor mind states. And our poor mind states leads to us taking in more poor information or poor things, just entertainment and stuff, on top of the poor diets. It's all still relevant to what we got going on here today in America. It's all still relevant. So your attention is called again to the map of Africa, for it is very significant where the earliest invaders entered and permanently settled. They took over the areas of trade and easy contacts with their homeland and other nations of the world, a point that simply cannot be overstressed in considering the plight of African people. In the north, they settled around the Mediterranean, thereby maintaining contact with Europe and Asia. In the northeast, east, and south, they settled among the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, thereby keeping in touch with their homeland and the trade with their countries farther away. Black Africa was thus hemmed in and effectively cut off commercially and otherwise from the rest of the world. The techniques of penetration and dominance were varied. Some came as peaceful traders, and doubtless trade was all that was intended by many. Africans were always eager traders. The main attraction for foreigners was that they brought in many new kinds of commodities. These traders had little or no trouble in gaining coastal footholds as trading posts. The land was not sold, but leased. However, the blacks had what the world wanted most: gold, diamonds, ivory, copper, iron, ore, and African people themselves. The trading posts soon became strong fortifications around which villages and towns sprang up as settlers from Asia poured in and armed forces became organized. The Africans watched these developments with increasing apprehension, for the traders were often armed with superior and different types of weapons of war and spent much time in training recruits, including Africans. Indeed, in some areas, a definite pattern emerged: an all African army under Asian officers, a pattern to be followed later by the Europeans. This was easy enough for the Arabs. They owned and captured Africans who made up their fighting forces. The Africans could blame only themselves for this. Here, as in certain other things, they were still engaged in practices which, while once universal, had long since been dying out or generally abandoned by the rest of the world. This one was the enslavement of captured prisoners of war. When African chiefs and kings began to sell those slave-hungry Arabs, they set in motion a chain of events that was to undermine the civilizations of the most advanced societies on the continent, further checking their progress and degrading their whole race for another 2,000 years. When the sale of their fellows became their chief source of wealth, African leaders became increasingly estranged from the finest things in African life: the sense of community and kinship with all who would be friends. When greed severed the traditional ties of brotherhood, gradual movement of the invaders from the coastal seas inland became relatively easy. Blacks against blacks, with increasing suspicion and hatred, may be traced to the Africans' own slave raids. The inland raids for slaves raised by some chief and raiders were attacked, but this opposition was not always due to any opposition to slavery, but to this kind of direct action which bypassed the chiefs and therefore eliminated their profits. So now with that's the conquest of African people by force. So yes, African people did and have always seemingly partnered with the enemies to help sell out other black people. There have always been black sellouts. The key is to recognize the sellouts and So now we're talking about the conquest. This last part is the conquest of blacks by religion. All right. Other invaders found penetration easily under the banner of religion. Full advantage was taken of the fact that Africans are a very religious people. First came the crescent flag of the prophet. 1. There were, however, numerous chiefs who not only opposed slavery, but fought against it to the death, literally. Some were encircled and with their whole people died fighting the enslaver to the end. 2. The Christian churches of 4th century Africa were independent of Western imperialism. They therefore could not be used as basis. The Islamic advance was three-pronged: proselytizing missions, claiming one brotherhood, widespreading intermarriages, and concubinage with African women due to Muslim system of polygamy, and forceful convictions at the sword. The cross of Jesus Christ followed the Muslim crescent. The cloak of Christianity was a most convenient hiding place for those who had other designs. Hence the drive to convert. Conversion here meant far more than conversion to Christianity. As in the case of Islam, it meant change into the white man's image, his ideas and value system. The real object of worship turned out to be neither Jesus Christ nor his Father God, but Western man and Western civilization. Christian brotherhood, well, yes, it's in principle or to be practiced. You blacks can have all the Christian brotherhood you desire among yourselves. Apartheid was Africa-wide under colonialism and not a particularity of South Africa, of the South African system, as so many are led to think. But what happened in the process of converting the blacks to Islam and Christianity was the supreme triumph of the white world over the blacks. Millions of Africans became non-Africans. Africans who were neither Muslims nor Christians were classed as pagans and therefore required to disavow their whole culture and to regard particularly all African institutions as backward or savage. The blacks in their own right became non-persons, members of a race of nobodies, and so hopeless that self-realization as personalities, even in the subordinate states, could only be achieved by becoming Muslims or Christians. Ain't that something? The only way you can become a human being at that time, they're saying, is to become a Muslim or a Christian. Indeed, in order to destroy completely not only their African heritage, but also their very African identity. Physiologically, they were forced to change their names to Arabic and Christian names. Henceforth, if these black Emils, Johns, Muhammads, Samuels, and Abdullahs happen to achieve greatness in some field, the assumption would be that it was Caucasian achievement, unless a special effort was made to identify the race of the person in question. Blacks at home in Africa and blacks scattered over the world bore the names of their enslavers and oppressors, the ultimate self-effacement that promoted the self-hatred which made pride and race difficult. That these psychological shackles still handicap not only the rebirth of modern African states, but also blacks everywhere should be obvious to all. Finally, there were the invaders who apparently disdained the cloak of deception and came in fighting. They had no problems. They knew no advance that they would find the Africans almost everywhere unprepared to defend themselves against a well-organized, well-trained body of men, no matter how small. This situation developed as splinter. Independent little states became more and more numerous. The use of secret agents seemed to be as old as organized states, for the practice of sending spies as goodwill ambassadors, traders, etc., well in advance into a country to be invaded goes back into antiquity. Those sent into Africa from various lands could report back that 1, the Africans were largely a peaceful people engaged in agriculture, mining, trade, fishing, the arts, crafts of various kinds, and manufacturing such things as pottery, furniture, building materials, boats, weapons of war, etc. 2, these settled states and their generally highly populated social and political systems indicate their advanced civilization. 3, but that they are well prepared for war. But that they are ill prepared for war, except against their neighbors, who also use the kind of spears, bows, and arrows which we abandoned long since. 4, in general, they have no swiftly moving mounted soldiers. 100 of our dashing cavalrymen with firepower could put 10,000 of them to flight. 5, they are a secretive people, for while they are fully aware of the great mineral wealth of the continent, they use it in a very limited way, mainly for personal adornment, and have no desire to open up to foreigners for world commerce that would greatly benefit them. They accordingly rigidly limit their trading activities, but mainly because Asians hold all of their seacoasts and have them cut off from the world and its trade. 6, finally, the whole of Africa could, with few exceptions, be progressively taken over simply by picking off one small state after another. For the overall pattern of the continent is of one countless small independent groups, each for itself and itself alone, right? There is no unity among them, even for a common defense, since it is the first duty of each chief to protect his people. All seem to be too proud to seek unity with other chiefs, thinking this might indicate a sign of weakness and itself invite attack. Therefore, it could have been truthfully reported that either Asians or Europe, anytime during the last thousands of years, that the widespread segmentation and attending disunity among the Africans made them easy to conquer and dominate. Some of these 6 hypothetical items would be valid as conclusions regarding a general situation only after the widespread collapse of strong Asian states, when small splintered states spread over the continent like an epidemic. But as we shall see, the united resistance of the blacks to white Asian invasions had been going on before recorded history began. And despite all the segmentations and endless invasions from the north, south, east, and west, there were black nations that kept up the resistance of 5,000 years, right down into the 20th century. We shall review some of these chapters which follow. So, and that's from pages 46 to 61, chapter 1. 46 to 61, and the destruction of Black civilization. So now we have a better understanding, a better foundational understanding of what happened to Africa and why it happened to Africa, why Africa was and still is so vulnerable. Some of that had to do with African people themselves. African people themselves, because of the disunity, made themselves vulnerable to the Asians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Europeans, now the Chinese that are in Africa taking what they want to take. Africa has been reshaped so many times. It's ridiculous. But as Chancellor Williams stated, there's always going to be Africans who are fighting for the independence and the liberation of African people. But in our fight, we must understand what happened to us, and we must understand our enemies. And with that better understanding, we should come up with greater tactics and strategies to defend ourselves and liberate ourselves. Another piece of the puzzle is this book. Every book I read is a piece of the puzzle to a greater map to show us how to better liberate ourselves. We just have to understand what we're reading, be able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. That's why I love these readings. I love these readings. I appreciate you all for choosing this book. It's a great book. Even though I thought all the books I would have read, anyone, I'm a bit excited, but this is a great historical foundation that we need on top of all of the Black psychology that we have been reading. So thank you all for all of y'all's support. Thank you all. Thank everybody for just continuing to watch my videos, like them, share them, comment, everything. I just appreciate everything. I do want to give a quick shout out. I have a new patron, Brandon Williams. I want to give a shout out to Brandon Williams for becoming my new patron. You're the man, Brandon. I appreciate your support. Your support will not only go into helping to grow this channel, but also into funding my Black History School. I had my latest class on Saturday, this past Saturday. I had my latest class. We had fun. What did we learn about? Let me give y'all a little insight of what we learned about real quick. I'll give you just a little overview of my outline that I used. So we had an icebreaker where I had them read a paragraph about George Washington Carver. And then they had to answer some questions about George Washington Carver. So it was about them reading the information and then me asking them what they think about it before we answer the questions. I wanted to get their own thoughts, have them critically think about it. And then we got into the questions that were dedicated to the reading. And that was great. Then we got into a self-esteem activity. I had them read a poem and really break down the poem. It was a poem dedicated to Black children. So read that poem, break it down, and tell me what they think about it, and more critical thinking. My man Sam Carter came in. Shout out to Sam Carter. He came in and he gave the kids great information about how they can wrap their interest around this historical information and be able to use it. And we came up with some ideas of how we can generate revenue for our Black History School. I always give the kids people to write about and read about. So the kids read about I can't remember, but it was three of the students did their readings, and it was excellent. And then I taught them about Jan Max Liga, the Black Dutchman who created the shoelaster machine, who basically made the shoe industry what it is with the creation of the shoelaster machine. And so that was the totality of our 2 hours that we spent on Saturday. So that's just an insight into some of the things that we do in our Black History School. And I'm going to make sure we get us to museums and do all type of tours and just see all type of things. And we're picking the book that we're going to read. So as a whole, because I want to make sure we're reading and we're using critical thinking and we're able to learn and utilize what we learn. So all of the support that you are giving me is being poured into the students that I have. And I love what I do. And I love what's happening right now. And I love you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. Thank you all. And make sure y'all catch the next video coming up.